Hello, I'm Anand Paropkari and I'm from Persistent and I'm Agile coach, helping teams implement Agile in their project works here. So, I'm here to introduce you the concepts of agility and Scrum and that you can apply to your projects. Isn't that cool? So, let's get started with. By the way, do you know what Agile is and how Agile started? The Agile started basically for developing products in a very small and incremental way, so that the products could be useful for the end customers and those could be shipped rather quickly, and the functionality that is built incrementally, so that you do not have to wait for the entire product to be available for end consumers to consume. And as you guess, this is a very popular methodology now, in fact a de facto software development methodology that everybody across the globe uses. Isn't that cool? So, let us see how we can use the agile methods for the project's work. I know you do a lot of projects of implementing software, hardware in your college term work. So, how can the practices of agile help you implement and not only do the project, but also learn agile hands on? Okay? Let's go one by one. Before we get into the practices of agile, let us look at what the agile manifesto is. The agile manifesto actually talks about some governing principles of why and how agile really works. The first manifesto principle is about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. What does this really mean is that there is a lot of importance on people interacting about how the software should work, what they really want out of it, and how and what kind of problems areas the end users face and how software can really help them solve it. The second one is about working software over comprehensive documentation. Historically, when softwares were developed, people emphasize lot on creating documentations as well. So, the early part of software development involved creating lots of documents, for example, requirements document, design document and associated plans and so on so things. However, the working software was available only at the end of the project after several months, and it was probably too late for people to understand how software actually taking the shape. So, in agile methodology, there is a lot of importance on balancing the documentation required and the working software delivery. So, you do not have to wait really for the end of the project to see what software is being developed and how it functions and how it looks like. So, at every increment you get to see and use a working piece of software. So, the needs of documentation and the delivery of working softwares are perfectly balanced. The third one is about collaborating with the customers rather negotiating with the contracts. So, historically when the software contracts were established, the customers and the service providers, they had an agreement documented as a legal contract and saying this is what we will do, this is what we will not do, these are the requirements, these are in scope, this is out of scope and so on and so forth. So, when some changes were needed for the sake of business, there was really fight in terms of whether it was needed or not needed and should it be done or not done. Agile says that do not fight on such kind of thing, because we exist to help customers win and solve their business problems. So, rather collaborate with customers in order to implement the software features and the requirements that are needed for them, and that is how the collaboration should really help them rather than negotiating with the contractual terms and conditions and the requirement and scope and so on and so forth. And the last but not least is the responding to the change rather than following a rigid plan. So, historical methods required a deliberated plan to be created to the last task that could happen as a part of project, and this plan was orchestrated to ensure that everything happens on time and as described in the contract and the plan. Of course, it was relevant at that point of time, but however, now since there are a lot of changes that are evolving at a very fast pace, such planning and implementing rigorously various practices involved and implementing software in that manner has become kind of redundant. So, we need to anticipate change and we need to entertain such change, because those change are essential for helping the business successful, helping our end users help solve the problems, and the agile methodology really emphasizes a lot on respecting the change, accepting the change, and in the next increment the change is delivered with a useful software. Isn't that fantastic? Okay, let's see how it works. So, when do you start your projects? What is the first step that you do? You talk to your professors, your guide, your mentor, and you identify a suitable topic for taking a project. And it could be like, you go to an industry, get a real problem to solve, or you identify a problem yourself, set up a team, and then just do the project, isn't it? And apart from this, you have a set of requirements per se. For example, your guide or mentor could give you certain ideas to implement it as a software features, or your actual industry mentor could give you a set of requirements to implement. And then you put at a kind of a requirements document, you set up a team of 2 or 3 people, your friends, your colleagues, and then you start simply writing the software. And over a period of time, you have a beautiful software which is the project shaping up, and after probably few weeks you are simply done with it, and then you test and it works. What else you want, right? So, this is a rather ad hoc way of developing a project, and although you have studied a lot of software engineering methods, there is a value in applying consciously these practices, because when you apply these practices while you do a project work, it provides you immense knowledge and experience of developing something which is a way of working in an industry. And of course, all of you are going to work with the industry. Either you will have your own startups, or you will work in a company like ours where you will be helping us building softwares. So, it is very essential for you to know how Agile really works, what are practices, and how those could be applied. What if you create your projects in Agile way? What if you apply Agile practices for your software projects? Nothing like that, isn't it? So, let's look at how Scrum really works. Now, what you see on your screen is this very simple model of Scrum, and Scrum is one of the Agile methodologies, and there are plenty of others where we can just list it down. There is XP, there is a Lean, there is a DAD, there is a Scaled Agile framework, and so on and so forth. But for the sake of the discussion, let us focus on Scrum, because everything has essentially evolved or could be distilled to what Scrum looks like. Okay? So, what you need as a entire ecosystem of running the Scrum is a customer who is going to consume the product that you are creating, the software that you are creating, and a product owner who actually represents your customer. So, product owner is a person who really understands customer's domain, their requirements, and is available to interface with the engineering team, because your customers may not be accessible all the time. So, but the product owner actually helps you fill the gap. And then you have a Scrum team. A Scrum team is a very important and integral part of the development, and the other person, a role involved, is the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is one of the team member. However, the Scrum Master plays a role of a mentor or a facilitator for the team, and this role is very important, and we will see how. As a part of the respective practices, you have a backlog. A backlog in a nutshell is simply a to-do list. Okay? So, list of things to do, and what would backlog contain? Requirements, right? Isn't that common? Isn't that common sense? So, backlog contains your requirements. So, there are multiple types of backlogs. A backlog which is at a higher end represents the product backlog. So, it has backlog items or the high level features or so called epics, and those epics or the high level requirements are essentially what your software delivers as a value. But those epics are complex, those are much more difficult to implement. So, those are required to be broken down into smaller chunks, so that individual teams can implement it in an easy manner. And these pieces are called user stories. User stories actually help us understand how a user is going to use a feature and how that feature and the system is going to interact with the end consumers, right. So, it is a very simple standalone clear requirement as a part of user story. And there is another set of backlog which the team uses is a sprint backlog, and sprint backlog actually contains the stories, right. So, the requirements are part of your backlog, and there are at least two kinds of backlog. One is a product backlog, where you have epics or nothing but a complex or more significant requirements. At the team level, you have small chunks of requirements which are simplified in the form of a user story, and that is a sprint backlog. Now, how does this backlog work? The product owner is primary owner of the backlog. The product owner interacts with the customer and identifies his or her needs, what software should actually provide them as a feature, how it should behave, how it should not behave, what are different integration points and expectations that the customers have. All those are identified as roadmap items, and they sit in the product backlog, and these are the essential starting points. Now, the backlogs may or may not be complete at any given point of time, because we want flexibility, we want the backlogs to kind of continually evolve, because the end users may not know what entire set of requirements could be. So, we identify the requirements in a progressive manner, and as good as we have a simple and important ones identified, we simply start processing them in an incremental manner. The next set of things are the sprint level backlogs, where the sprint backlog actually translated from the product backlog. The epic, which is a complex requirement in a sense, is split into multiple user stories, and user story is a very simplified nature of requirement, and the user story format reads as is: I as a user want to do something so that I will get a benefit, right. So, it is a 3-part statement, one single line 3-part statement, which says how a user story should be written. Isn't it simple? Let's take an example of a user story. Let's say I am building an e-commerce website and I am a buyer. So, one of the user story could be, I as a buyer want to select products so that I can view them together and pay for them, right. So, it is very clear for us as a software developer to know what exactly it needs to be done. So, I as a user, so you know that this is a end user, and the second piece talks about I want to select products. So, I need a way, a mechanism, a facility to select the individual product that I am browsing through, so that I can look at them together. So, I should be able to see what products I have listed as a list, and I should be able to pay for them when I am checking out, right. So, it is a very clear, absolutely unambiguous and very straightforward piece of requirement. So, when you implement this particular feature as a part of your sprint, you actually deliver a working piece of software, right. This is what the crux of agility is, that we are delivering a very simple, clear and fully functional software requirement to our end users, so that they can start working. So, each of our epics and associated stories actually write down the requirements in this particular manner. Okay? Yeah, then what next about the backlog, about the priority? How do you know which one to go first? Simple, the prioritization, isn't it? So, each of the atom in the backlog has a defined priority, priority 1, 2, 3 and so on and so forth. Similarly, the sprint backlog level, you have priority defined as priority 1, 2, 3. Which one the team would pick up? Absolutely, it is like priority 1 stories and second stories and third so forth. So, it is very straightforward for team to work upon the ones that are important, and the priority comes from the customer and the product owner. They know what they want first, and then team simply picks up the stories from the backlog. Once the backlogs are created, established, the team gets into a grooming meeting. So, grooming meeting nothing but is a meeting to understand what the backlog really contains, what those requirements are, and if team has any question about those requirements, about their implementation, about the understanding of how this particular requirement could be implemented, that kind of discussion is facilitated in the grooming meeting. And this grooming meeting actually helps team understand the requirements in entirety, so that they, when they go into actual sprint of really working, they can work more efficiently, and they do not have to hunt for asking queries, questions and waiting for resolutions to come in. So, they have all the inputs required for implementing the story. As a part of the planning is another important activity that takes place is about estimation. So, estimation is conducted using relative sizing, and is a very simple and straightforward technique to implement the stories. The relative sizing works in a manner where the team has to identify and assign a number to the story which represents its size, okay? And the sizing is typically done using Fibonacci series. You know Fibonacci series, right? So, Fibonacci series is 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8 and 11 and so on and so forth. Each of this number is picked up to represent the complexity of the story, right. If the requirement is simple enough, then the team members would assign a story point, let us say 5, or if the requirement is complex enough, the size could be as high as like 21 or even more than that. And if a team cannot really identify the size, they would assign a number called infinity. So, that simply indicates that this story is too complex to estimate at this point of time. And how do you handle this situation? Simple. You split the requirement so that the complexity is broken down, and you have better chance of assessing its complexity and estimating and sizing it, right. So, all such complex stories are then broken down to make it simple enough and tangible enough to deliver, and team would then estimate it. So, during sizing and estimation activity, each of the team member would assign a size to each of the story that is under planning, and if there is a difference of opinion, that is quite possible, right. So, some team member may feel that a story has a size of 5, others would feel that it is 13, and there could be a disagreement. How do you resolve this? By discussion, is not it? So, it is quite possible that a member who says the story has a size of 5 may have assumed something which he thinks that it would help the implementation simpler. However, the other person who is sizing a 13 may have paid attention to something which might be required to implement, which is not stated, it is implicit, and that is the reason she is saying it is 13. So, these team members would discuss their point of views and then arrive at a common consensus saying whether it is 5 or 13. It could be either of the possibilities, or they could even say, oh no, both of us are wrong, let's size it 8. So, essentially the sizing is a important activity where every team members get an opportunity to say how complex the story is, and whether the story needs to be broken down further or not. So, once the stories are sized, team would then know what is the total complexity of the backlog, because now you have a complexity for every story, you can easily aggregate for the stories that are in a backlog. But know what? There is a limited capacity available, and the agile scrum teams are usually 5 to 8 people, not more than that, because then collaboration becomes very difficult. not smaller than that, because then there is no opportunity to collaborate, right. So, such teams would then have to understand what is their actual capacity to deliver, and to arrive at the answer they will simply look at what they have delivered in the past, how many story points they could deliver. And if case where you do not have such data, you are starting your first sprint, it is obvious to assume something and then get started, or just leave it unanswered. After a couple of sprints, you will anyway know how many stories you could deliver in a given sprint, and the sprint is typically of a 2-week duration. Why 2 week? Agile does not dictate any particular time box as such, but 2 week is a generally agreed upon duration where an incremental software delivery could really make sense for end users, right. Later than 2 week may not be a agile characteristics, because here you want to have a frequent and incremental delivery of the software. Less than 1 week may not even work, because you need a substantial amount of time to actually work upon the stories and have a meaningful feature developed. Is possible to actually develop and deliver stories at a increment faster than probably 2 weeks or 1 week or even every day. However, it requires a lot of technological backbone establishment, so that you have the appropriate amount of control on the quality of the software, the testing that goes in, the security checks that you apply, and so on and so forth. So that you can deliver in time whenever a particular feature is ready to do. It is not impossible, but at a project level probably 2 weeks makes more sense. Once the planning is complete, it is now time to execute. So, execution simply requires us to pick a story and start implementing. So, here unlike a conventional project manager, there is no project manager in a Scrum team, and there is no manager for assigning monitoring your work and progress, because this is a collaborative team, self-organizing team, and this is the characteristics of agility, that everyone is empowered, everyone is equally authorized to do things. So, team members simply pick up the stories that they would be working upon and delivering, right. So, right after the sprint planning, team would pick up the stories that they would work, and they would start implementing the functionalities. If there are any guidance needed to your colleagues or peers, you volunteer, you get them help, you seek help, you help each other, not just doing this, but also going to your product owner, going to your customer, seeking the input and validation of what you are doing. Or next 2 weeks the stories would be implemented, tested and available for showcasing. And now this is a very important aspect of the sprint and the Scrum, that you demonstrate the stories that are developed to the customer, and this is a real validation from the end customer whether you are heading in the right direction, whether the features are implemented the way end customers wanted. And the beauty of this agility is that you get a real time feedback, right. The customers do not have to wait for entire product to be completed and tested to see how things are being implemented, and if there is any correction needed, there is an opportunity for you to get that feedback quickly and make those corrections, so that the next increment can actually be done in a better way, so that the value reaches to customer faster. So, the demos are a very important and crucial aspects of the Agile and Scrum deliveries. During the stand up meetings, during the Scrums, the teams would conduct the stand up meetings, and as the name says, it is a quick stand up meeting, 15 minutes max, right. And the stand up meetings are actually helpful to know whether every team member is completing the task on time, and whether they know what is lying in front of them for the next days, and what are the issues or challenges that they are facing. So, the Scrum Master would know who needs help, and if there are any issues or impediments, how and when then they could be resolved. So, it is a very simple and very straightforward way to know the progress. Apart from the stand up meeting, there are tools like burn down charts. So, burn down chart is a very simple technique to know how the stories are getting built vis-a-vis the effort that the team is putting in, right. So, the burn down really helps team know whether they would be completing the work on time or they are getting delayed. As we talked about accepting the change as a part of manifesto, right, you may encounter a change from the product owner or the client actually during the sprint or even any point of your life cycle activities. What do you do then, right? You have to listen to the change and the rationale for that and see how the change could be implemented. It is not a good practice to take a change during the implementation, because why? It disrupts whatever you are doing, right. But since the agile exists for the benefit of end users, you need to really see whether the change is really important and critical, and if it can wait for the next sprint, you may want to negotiate that with the product owner. So, if a change that must be accommodated in this sprint, you go back to your product owner, revisit your plan, and then take up this change in lieu of something which is of a lower priority from your backlog, right, and decide the implementation of the change. This is how a change could be accepted. The other way could be you identify and prioritize the change and keep it a part of a backlog. So, when you start your next sprint, the change is available for you to process. So, that the change could be taken up as a part of next sprint and delivered, right. So, the client does not have to fight with you for any new idea she might get to implement in the product that they have, or their business might have changed and there are new things that could be needed. They have an opportunity to go back to you and say, my requirements have now changed, or there are new set of things that we want to do, please accept it as a part of backlog. So, it can anytime go to your product backlog, and from product backlog with the prioritization they can flow to your sprint backlog and then later could be implemented. Isn't this wonderful? Isn't this something that makes really exciting thing for software development? And that is why clients love the agile methodologies, and that is the reason you should learn these in your project, so that when you go to industry you know how to apply these practices, right. At the end of your 2-week sprint, you have something which could be deployed into production, which is a incrementally working feature or a product which is ready to be deployed into production. So, this is how a typical sprint would work, and end of the sprint teams would conduct a retrospection. So, retrospection is a very simple technique to know and understand how they have functioned and delivered as a team. Are there any opportunities for them to improve and how they could actually make it better? What are the things that they have done really well, so that they can continue doing it in the upcoming sprint? And there are multiple ways people run retrospectives. The important thing is looking at ourselves as a team and identify what are the characteristics that they as a team need to sustain and do better, and how can they deliver even better phenomenal software features in the upcoming sprints, right. And this 2-week sprint time box would repeat then ever after until the product is ready and complete and shippable. That is how the Scrum works. Are you ready to implement in your projects? Good, exciting, get started then.